let me go ahead again, give a quick introduction, and then we'll jump into our first clip. So Deconstructing Proxy Racism, again, we hope to bring to you every Saturday night, 9 o'clock p.m. Eastern time. Our topics tonight is defining proxy racism, defining how it works, and examples of proxy racism. Then later, we will open up for the question and answer session, and we'll also be checking the comment section. I wonder if people could hear me beforehand, because nobody said anything in the live and they were liking the live. So, but anyway, the definition, once again, let's hit that real quick. Proxy racism is the phenomenon of non-white individuals supporting or advancing systemic white supremacy or systemic racism through their actions, decisions, or rhetoric, whether knowingly or inadvertently. Okay, that's the definition, and you can find this page that was set up in 2016 on Facebook. Just do a Google search for proxy racism, or Facebook search, I should say, for proxy racism. And that's a page that is managed by our nonprofit Black Talk Media Project to educate particularly non-white individuals, specifically Black individuals, on how they are either consciously, which can sometimes lead to them consciously practicing or upholding a system of racism as defined within this definition. So the first segment we want to jump to, we want to go back in history. In the 1600s is when, in the United States, or on this continent, North America, or in Turtle Island, as some of the indigenous nations had defined this landmass, in the colony of Virginia, when they were first introducing laws to introduce chattel slavery, before they had indentured servitude, then they introduced chattel slavery and made it a race-based chattel slavery. That's when you could say the classifications of black and white were created in the early 1600s, right? And so, while they did interact with the First Nation peoples in the beginning as if they were equal, they were still slyly practicing, planning and waiting until they got their numbers up to practice racism against them, because they were viewing them as non-white, regardless. And people will be nice to you, to get next to you, to study you, to find out your habits, to, in military terms, scout you, find out your strengths and your weaknesses. And then once they have the numbers and the resources, and then that's when the genocide begins, all right? But in the early days of colonial, when Turtle Island was being first colonized, they used proxy racism. They used non-white people to practice racism against other non-white people, other indigenous tribes, because they all weren't all under one government or nation, because people use those terms interchangeably, and a nation doesn't necessarily mean a democratic government or a communist government. A lot of those people a lot of tribes didn't have strict hierarchies like that. They loosely governed themselves. They had elders and what have you, but that's a lot different than having governments with people in positions that have been granted powers over everybody else, okay? So this first clip, and I'll need to get this disclaimer, is a non-white person posted this to Facebook. YouTube is where I found this clip of this video I'm gonna share with you. It's about 9 minutes long. His name is Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell. Guess where Thomas Sowell is from? North Carolina, right here in my county where I was born, Gaston County. He's a fellow Gastonite, as I taken to call those who know the history of this county. And I only found that out in the past, maybe 5 or 6 years. But Thomas Sowell, some of you may know him as a, not a co-host, but a substitute host for Rush Limbaugh when he was still alive, and spewing his racist propaganda out over the airways to millions and millions, maybe hundreds of millions of people. Well, Thomas Sowell, a African-American descendant of victims of slavery, okay, he's a tool of proxy racism. He engages in proxy racism. He posted this. So I'm saying all this, he wouldn't have posted it if it wasn't given or making excuses for the white people, because I kind of like picked up on it's kind of doing some victim blaming and blaming certain tribes for their own moral failings and what have you, as a way to excuse this, you know, what the genocide that was already being plotted and planned ahead of time. Okay. And these people were unsuspecting. But again, if they had not participated, if they had been educated about this system and how it relies on our collaboration, the intended victims, our collaboration in order to carry out the master plan. That's step one. That has been step one in the white supremacist colonization of the planet. Whether we're talking about the United States or the UK, the United Kingdom, which at one time was the largest colonizer, white supremacist colonizer on the planet, but the United States has surpassed them now, and they really rely on it. So any of it, but they all operate on the same system and work together because they recognize each other as being white. The people, you know, and so yeah. But make no mistake, that's why I say the United States of America Incorporated is me living here is behind the enemy lines, because this is ground zero for global white supremacy right now. It used to be the UK, but no, it's right here. It's right here. Who else? And I know the UK try to act like, you know, they pitching in, and maybe Australia, but they are not contributing the billions and billions. And if we're talking about history, the trillions of dollars in munitions and military assistance and also welfare, and to help colonize all these other non-white majority lands. But tonight, we're going to start with how that system got a foothold on this continent. All right. But also, please, please take notes, try to pay attention to the use of words so that we don't get fooled, or we can train ourselves to identify, well, that sounds kind of racist, or like he's whitewashing it, or whatever. And, you know, we just have to always be on guard is what I'm trying to say. So let me go ahead and pull up this video. That will be Thomas Sowell. And I've never met this guy. He, again, is from here, is born here, but I've never read anything in the paper about him being here. Let me redo that. Okay. Let's start that. It's from the book of Conquest and Cultures.
The various indigenous peoples fought among themselves for access to European trading posts, where beaver furs could be traded for goods from across the Atlantic. Among these goods, perhaps the most faithful were guns and liquor. Those Indians immediately in contact with Europeans fought off other Indians trying to reach them, so that most of the furs traded to Europeans came from Indians who had not themselves trapped the animals, but who had acquired their pelts in trade from other Indians farther away, in exchange for European goods supplied by the Indian middlemen, who made a profit on both exchanges. Thus, the Cree Indians on the shores of Hudson's Bay became middlemen in the fur trade, and the Iroquois, who dominated the region between the Alleghenies and the Great Lakes, cut off the Ottawas and the Hurons from Quebec and Montreal. In order to get around the Iroquois, the French ventured farther west. More than trade alone was involved. Because access to Europeans meant access to European firearms, this caused a shift in the military balance of power among Indians. The Cree Indians, for example, acquired more than 10,000 firearms from the Hudson Bay Company between 1670 and 1689, not counting the additional firearms they were getting in trade with the French. Those Indians in direct contact with white settlements could acquire enough firearms to shift the military balance of power against rival tribes and nations, whom they accordingly barred from having the same direct contact. Thus the Ojibwa not only acquired guns, but strove to drive the Sioux and the Fox tribes away from the Great Lakes, where they too might have acquired guns. These guns could of course also be used against the white settlers, and often were, but a limiting factor for the Indians was that they needed the settlers not only to supply firearms, but also to repair them and to supply ammunition. In an outbreak of warfare between Indians and whites in 17th century Massachusetts, for example, the Indians won more battles, but the whites won the war when the Indians' ammunition began to run out. In general, warfare between whites and Indians was less common during the colonial era than warfare among the Indians, fighting with one another for access to European settlements. Indian tribes or nations, determined to break through rival tribes or nations who held them at bay from the European trading posts, launched attacks and invasions to gain the coveted access. The Hurons held annual meetings with other local Indians, warning them not to attempt to make direct contact with the French. Later, the Iroquois decimated the Hurons, forcing their remnants westward while absorbing some of the survivors into the Iroquois Confederation. Meanwhile, the Europeans sought better access to the Indian suppliers of pelts without having to go through middlemen. Many of the explorations of the British and the French were for the purpose of finding water routes taking them further inland to the Indians who were the original trappers, where trades could be made without paying the middleman's profit. Isolated European traders, more noted for their courage than their scruples, often penetrated deeper into Indian territory in search of better trading terms and bigger profits. Here and there, organized settlements of whites in colonial North America were able to raid or invade local Indians' territory, but usually there was no need to risk such trials of arms. Moreover, the European settlers were as anxious for the furs traded by the Indians as the Indians were for European goods. Over time, however, as the beavers began to be hunted to extinction in the eastern regions of North America, the fur trade moved west to find new beaver populations. Those Indians who had abandoned their traditional means of livelihood in favor of trade with the European settlers were left in a particularly difficult position after the loss of both hunting opportunities and of their traditional artisan skills. Where there was no such economic interdependence, as in colonial Virginia, where tobacco rather than fur was the great export, military hostilities between whites and Indians developed early on. While the first James River settlers readily traded copper for food, escalating corn prices led to forcible seizures of Indian corn and cornfields by the whites, initiating a series of wars in which hundreds were killed on each side. Unlike furs, which white settlers obtained in trade with the Indians, tobacco was grown by the colonists themselves. Although the original settlers were outnumbered by the Powhatan Indians by well over 100 to 1 in the early 17th century, the rapidly growing white population of Virginia was by 1675 more than 10 times the size of the Indian population. While Europeans ultimately prevailed militarily in both North and South America, this was a much more protracted process in the United States and Canada than in Latin America. Moreover, the nature of the Europeans' hegemony differed as between the Iberians, on the one hand, and the British, French, and Americans on the other. In particular, the colonies of transplanted British and French communities in North America remained a largely insular world of their own, with Europeans living in European communities and Indians living in Indian communities, however much the boundaries between the two might move over the years, and however much interaction there might be in the frontier zones between the two. Seldom was there a situation such as that in Spanish America, where a European overlord class lived directly off the work of the indigenous peoples living in European-controlled territory. The exchange of Indian land for European goods was seldom an individual transaction. That is, individual white settlers did not usually buy land from individual Indians and go live in the midst of Indian communities. Rather, officials of the colonial settler governments purchased large tracts of land from Indian tribes and then subdivided it among individual white purchasers. Indeed, all colonial governments at one time or another banned individual land purchases from individual Indians because of the legal and other complications this could cause. Even after the white population grew larger and more powerful in colonial North America, expansion into Indian territory seldom took the classic form of conquest of one sovereign nation by another. The drive for expansion into Indian lands was often led by freelance adventurers rather than by government military forces. Under frontier conditions, even governments on the scene had only limited control of all the people nominally under their authority. As late as 1792, Thomas Jefferson wrote in a letter, "I hope, too, that your admonitions against encroachments on the Indian lands will have a beneficial effect. The U.S. finds an Indian war too serious a thing to risk incurring one merely to gratify a few intruders with settlements, which are to cost the other inhabitants of the U.S. 1,000 times their value in taxes for carrying on the war they produce. I am satisfied it will ever be preferred to send armed force and make war against the intruders as being more just and less expensive." Control on the Indian side was not necessarily any more effective, in part because many North American Indians did not have the kind of governmental structures to control their own people that Europeans did. Chiefs selected to lead hunts or to lead wars had no permanent power to impose their will on the whole society. When Indian braves saw their lands invaded by whites, they could strike back and thereby unleash a war between the races, regardless of what more cautious advice might be given them by their elders. Under these circumstances of uncontrollable groups on both sides, outbreaks of frontier warfare between Europeans and Indians did not always depend on decisions made by leaders on either side. The French had a somewhat similar problem with individual entrepreneurs in the fur trade, who in effect extended the European settlements beyond bounds considered militarily defensible. In general, the expansion of the white settlers into Indian territory in North America was directed primarily toward taking over the land itself, rather than acquiring Indians as subjects of the government or as vassals of white landowners or of European ecclesiastical establishments, as happened in much of Spanish America. One consequence of this difference was that Indian and European races were much less mixed in British North America than in Spanish America, where a substantial part of the entire population was of mixed blood after 3 centuries of rule by the Spaniards. Because the advancing Europeans did not generally acquire sovereignty over the Indians living on the invaded territories, the Indians forced off these lands retreated to new lands, where their sovereignty remained more or less intact. Thus, a century after the United States was formed, there were still Indian nations capable of fighting the U.S. Army and of defeating Custer at the Little Bighorn. Only after the American nation spread from the Atlantic to the Pacific was federal sovereignty.
All right, one thing that I did pick up on is they talked about in West Virginia, talking about the colonists grew tobacco themselves, and no, that's a lie. They ain't grow nothing themselves. They use victims of white supremacy or victims of slavery, particularly black victims, and they use indigent servants. So I would have to know the exact era or the exact dates that they're talking about in the 1600s. Again, they're talking about the 1600s there. And so again, I would submit to anyone that if the so-called, I've heard them refer to the Eastern tribes or the so-called 5 civilized tribes had not engaged in collaborating with these white people to practice racism against other non-white people, other indigenous tribes, then, you know, who knows? They may have saved the world. Maybe the United States never becomes a thing, and the global, dominant entity practicing racism and spreading it all around the world. If only they had not, got those firearms and what have you, and turned them on other non-white people to take their land and take their resources, and to also prevent them from acquiring firearms themselves. Now you gotta know, them white colonists knew exactly what they was doing. They knew they controlled the ammunition. They got to come to us. Once you run out, you ain't got no, you don't have any more. Those weapons just become big blunt objects or whatever. They're no longer, you no longer have an advantage. So they had to know. They had to know. So yeah, I think that if that interaction had gone differently, that those people had been aware. Well, I guess no, I don't know. Should we give them some grace because the system of white supremacy was just being invented right there at that point in time? So it was kind of new to everyone. So they wasn't aware that, in those courts, they maybe had this chattel-based slavery. Now, some of those tribes knew. The Cherokee of North Carolina, the ones that got relocated later to Oklahoma, they were slavers themselves. They had, some of them worked on the slave patrols. They gave up, and I think that video I just played, a portion of that documentary from that book, talked about them giving up their culture, giving up their spirituality, or AKA religion, and just trying to be like white. Not like Michael Jordan. They wasn't trying to be like Mike. They were trying to be like white. And thinking forever that they will have a comfortable position by helping these white people practice racism and white supremacy against African descendants, African people. Again, we're talking about the 1600s. This is way before the 1800s, because most of the victims of slavery were born right here on this continent. But we're talking early, bred like cattle, into the millions. I think at the end of the Civil War, something like 5 million. Victims of slavery. And so, yeah, I have to say, man, if only we could have a real Wayback Machine or a time machine, as they say, well, we could go back and we could warn people, you know what I'm saying? Don't do it. Don't be like white. This is what this is going to lead to, okay? And so it took them to get the numbers, because the war against the First Nation tribes that were in the Midwest and going out west and what have you. By that time, we're talking 1800s, where the whites had the numbers. They still didn't outnumber them, but they had the numbers and the firearms and the ammunition to bring to bear that the other people, despite their numbers, couldn't withstand it. Same thing happened in India. Same thing happened in Africa. Anywhere these people have Philippines, Hawaii, any place these people have gone, they have used violence, and their primary advantage has been firearms to create their empire. So the next one that I want to get to is, I came across this clip. I didn't agree with everything that was said, but enough of it was constructive. You know, again, as the saying goes, we when we're eating a piece of meat, we spit out the bones. We don't swallow the bones, that which is not nourishment for our bodies, or in this case, our minds. But we keep that which is the meat. So I made this clip. I'm not sure how long it is. It might be about 5 minutes from them talking about. It was titled, and I have the title, and the YouTube page will be up. But it's talking about the black bourgeoisie. It's talking about the black bourgeoisie. So let's go ahead and pull that up, and hopefully learn something, because I definitely agree with some of the stuff, or it just confirmed other stuff I had heard before or thought of myself. Hey, what's up, Jerome? Anti-Racism TV. I see you made it, bro. I hope you'll stick around for the Q&A session. But I'm about to get into this clip about the black bourgeoisie. And it's about 5 minutes long. And this one, like the last clip, focused on the indigenous interactions with these white colonists that led to, we could say, the first domino tipping over, that led to the establishment of a racist, white supremacist global empire. Yeah, that's what. But this part, I think we're on this particular one, we're moving over to Africa, and how they did the same thing.
Orientation in its new African colonies. By introducing Christian religions and European cultural norms and values, the Europeans used various tactics to groom a class of black Africans to serve their mother country's interests. Molefe Sante describes this process of indoctrination in his work History of Africa, stating, "The French used assimilation, the British used collaboration of some local kings and ethnic groups, intermarried with the local African women, relying heavily upon the creation of a buffer class composed of children of the Portuguese settlers and Africans to eliminate all opposition to Portuguese rule." Indirect rule was a British policy advocated by Frederick Lugard, who argued in his 1922 book, The Dual Mandate in British Tropical Africa, that it was better to use local leaders to carry out the British governance rather than using settlers. If he could not find hereditary kings to his liking, he would replace them with puppets who would collaborate with the British. France also applied this governing strategy by corrupting some of the traditional leaders who enjoyed material rewards because of collusion with the colonizers. Another example of the grooming of an African bourgeoisie is found in the Congo and many Francophone countries. The term ouvrier is a term that's used to describe Africans who aspires to integrate into the overall colonial system. It is described as the native, under French colonial rule, could gain access to the superior plane of humanity through assimilation into French culture and society, with the ultimate reward of becoming an ouvrier. This implied getting rid of one's culture, religion, language, beliefs, and sense of belonging. Of course, the promise of full and equal citizenship dangled by the colonial skin was never actually fulfilled. It was always remained a horizon for the colonized to strive for, without ever being able to reach, and a very powerful means of social control for the colonizer. During the post-colonial period, many of these African bourgeoisie eventually assumed political positions of power due to their Western orientations to the expectations of their former European masters, while assisting to make their newly independent countries client states of the West. Finally, in Black America, the growth of a black bourgeoisie was a gradual process from the outset of the post-Civil War period. As with the Caribbean, mixed light-skinned blacks already had some freedom of movement in the South, but with the end of slavery came a problem for the wealthy plantation owners and northern industrialists on what to do with the free Negroes of America. This gave birth to a new black bourgeoisie who would become the hand-picked Negroes who would form and shape the future identity of the black elite. In E. Franklin Frazier's Black Bourgeoisie book, he exemplifies the formation of this black elite, stating, "Since the creation of these philanthropic foundations, such as the Peabody Fund, until the present, the Negro intellectual has been forced to shape not only his philosophy of racial adjustment, but his general social philosophy according to the social philosophy of the Northern, or in other words, white philanthropic foundations. It has not been necessary, of course, for the foundation to make explicit demands upon the Negro teacher or intellectual. The Negro teacher or intellectual realized that if he were to secure employment, he must indicate that his ideas of racial adjustment conform to the social philosophy of the foundations. This same class of well-meaning white folks will repeat this process throughout the 20th century, financing the creation of either black bourgeoisie-led or integrationist organizations such as the Sigma Phi Phi, or prominent civil rights groups such as the NAACP or Urban League. Contemporarily, this bourgeoisie is described by the late Glenn Ford, stating, "The current black misleadership class voluntarily joined the enemy camp, calling it progress, as soon as the constraints of official apartheid was lifted," referring to the gains of the civil rights movement. They exploited the political and business opportunities made possible by a people's mass movement in order to advance their own selfish agendas, and in the process made a pact with the white power structure to assist in the displacement and incarceration of millions of their brothers and sisters. In the case of black elected officials, their culpability is direct and hands-on.
So yeah, he was just talking about what happened in Africa, and then at the end he brought it back to America. Yeah, I definitely got to get back used to this platform and using this particular software that I'm using. I'm using the TikTok Live desktop software. I'm used to other stuff, but I'll tighten it up, y'all. I'll tighten it up. But yeah, let me go ahead. What I want to move on next to, now he was talking about earlier colonial periods in Africa, right? When they were, again, first going over there. And in Africa, prior to their arrival, the same thing was going on over here in Turtle Island. Different nations. These are not all, you can't look at it from a white supremacist point of view, who said if you're not white, then you're black, or they came up with other derogatory terms for other classifications of people, mongoloids, and y'all know the work of the anthropology, Charles Darwin. Y'all know how them people, white, quote unquote pseudoscientists, were out there practicing racism in the area of science, and they played a big role in the propagation. But we have to look at it. These are individual nations. Nations mean a group of people who share a common culture, spiritual belief, arts. Arts is in culture, and are united by language. All right. So you have hundreds of tribes on Turtle Island. You got hundreds of tribes over there in Africa. And so the white supremacists exploited that. See, those people, when they first came in contact, didn't know that that's how they had viewed the world and divided people in the world, and what they were getting ready to practice. So what they did was the white supremacists came in, exploited those differences, again, give them some firearms to use against their tribal, so-called ancestral enemies, and then allow them to weaken them and capture them for you, to bring them back to the coast and put them on a slave ship and carry them across the Atlantic to South America, the Caribbean, and North America. Okay? See, they wasn't prepared for that. But that's how we have to understand our role as non-white people in perpetuating this system, because it will collapse without collaborators. Yes, it is on white people, because they are in the most positions of power and have more influence or connections to these people. It is on them primarily to dismantle the system of white supremacy. But you know what? We can, as non-white people and the victims, cannot sit around waiting on them. So if we just decide to make hard choices and say, I'm not going to participate, then I believe the system will collapse. Then we'll have an opportunity to come up with something new, okay? And that could happen. So I want to move on then to them. The first time I heard somebody use the word proxy in relation to racism, white supremacy. And that was when because I'm a student of Malcolm X's, by watching all of his stuff, reading his watching his video archive, which is all on the internet, and also reading his letters, articles, and what have you, and his autobiography. And he was being interviewed by this suspected racist. I don't know if this white man was racist or not. Maybe just a proxy. I don't know. But anyway, the suspected racist was asking him questions, but this suspected racist is the one who pointed out the black proxies. Because, of course, they would know who was working for their white members of their culture or white supremacy. They know. And so, yeah, let's go ahead and cue that up. Let's get rid of this one and cue Malcolm X.
I'd like to, I'd cite one example would be Congressman Dawson, for example, in Chicago. In Chicago, a large number of liberals located in the Hyde Park district have consistently fought Dawson and his betrayals of the Negro, and they've also fought some of the people who represent Dawson on the Chicago City Council.
The only Negro I know who is constantly fought, only Negro politician that I know who is constantly fought by white liberals is Adam Clayton Powell. And they call him a racist because he...
Today, you could point to a large number of Negro leaders who have consistently betrayed Negroes in a whole host of areas.
They aren't really Negro leaders. These are puppets that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. These are parrots that have been put in front of the Negro community by white liberals. You can't name me a Negro leader who has been betrayed Negroes, who has not been endorsed, sanctioned, subsidized, and supported by the white liberals.
Minister Malcolm, I'd like to, well, I could cite one example would be Congressman Dawson, for example, in Chicago. In Chicago, a large number of liberals located in the Hyde Park district have consistently fought Dawson and his betrayals of the Negro, and they've also fought some of the people who represent Dawson on the Chicago City Council.
The only Negro I know who is constantly fought, only Negro politician that I know who is constantly fought by white liberals is Adam Clayton Powell. And they call him a racist because he...
Okay, I'm going to stop there. That was a live, excuse me, that was one of those YouTube shorts that I had came across. I guess he didn't use the word proxy. I was mistaken. He didn't use that word. I'm talking about the white man. But again, puppets, handpicked, and he used Congress, right? And later on, I'm going to, when I get to the section where I'm going to show you some examples, even though right now we're looking at examples from the past, but when we get to the present, one of the people featured is U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, who said some things today which I feel like was misinformation and miseducation, and just stating something that's not true, and saying something to give it as a hot take, whether you knew you were incorrect when you made the statement. And I'm not going to tell you all what she said, but it was incorrect. But it does contribute to white people not only practicing white supremacy, but giving them incentive. We'll call them the MAGA movement, the working class whites, that the wealthy whites use as their foot soldiers for white supremacy. Okay, so that may have been the last one. So let me go ahead once again and put up the definition. And I do need to take a short station identification break and give you an opportunity to use the facilities or get you some water or refresh your drink or whatever, give you a couple of minutes to do that. And then when we come back, we'll get into the modern examples of white supremacy. We're going to start where else but at the top, at the White House, and some of the proxies that are helping the Biden administration practice racism, global racism, particularly a genocide against non-white people. And it's just really disgusting. And we have other people, only ones I've seen are white people who resigned from the Biden administration because the genocide breached their morals and principles, and they resigned. And so I'm saying, where's that courage among these people in Congress, these people in the executive branch, legislative branch? Or are they put there to confuse us? Are we confused to think that racism doesn't exist? Because let's say, I don't know how many non-white members of Congress we have, but let's say 1/3 of them are white, are non-whites, okay? That does not mean that the U.S. government isn't racist. What determines whether the U.S. government is racist or not is the policies that it implements and carries out, right? Like the genocide. Okay, so yeah, when we come back on the other side, we'll jump into some modern examples, starting with the White House, got a couple of clips. Then we'll look at my area, one of my areas of producing media, being a content producer, being a content publisher, being the founder of a nonprofit media organization, Black Talk Media Project, which established Black Talk Radio Network as a safe space for non-white people, specifically Black people, to get into podcasting and digital radio broadcasting, because in 2007, we started on Blog Talk Radio, and a number of us Black hosts were kicked off. Our content heavily censored, and then giving us terms of service violations that didn't make any sense. I even had one of their managers, and his name is John Sweet. I'll never forget it. I don't know if he still works for him or not, but called me on my personal phone, which is okay because I gave that as my contact number when I set up the podcast or the broadcast, and asked me, this is when I first established blacktalkradionetwork.com, and the colors were at that time were red, black, and green, right? And And that's associated with black nationalism, right? And I would interview people. I interview all kinds of people, but I will have black nationalists on and we'll discuss black nationalism, but in the context of racism, white supremacy. And he didn't like that, John Sweet. And so he banned us. He banned us. And so that's when I went on to sink about $1,000 into research and development to do my own internet radio streaming. And so, hey, make a donation if you want to support the continued, work of our nonprofit. All right, so we're going to take this break and then we'll be back on the other side. Next clip that I want to get into is this White House clip that's going to feature her name. I think her first name is Jean or I don't know. But y'all know she's frequently in the news and y'all might recognize her. So let's go ahead and pull that up. Let me go ahead and close this camera out. Not the camera. The definition. And we will pull up the White House.
That we
The United States
fundamentally
rejects the
reject
court's decision to issue arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials.
We remain concerned by the prosecutors' rush to seek arrest warrants and the troubling process errors that led to this decision. The United States has been clear that the ICC does not have jurisdiction over this matter.
So they're just basically reading from a script, right? So how much do you think, we could look it up, but it's not really important. We could look it up, but how much y'all think they getting paid a year? What's their annual salary to get up there and just blatantly lie to the reporters and therefore the American people and just regurgitating all of them? A script. That's participating. And people want to talk about the patriarchy. Some of these women seem to be anxious to prove that they can be just as vicious, just as barbaric, and just as down with the system of white supremacy as males. Okay? And I think we need to recognize that fact, right? But again, we're focusing on non-white individuals and their role in this system and how it's used to confuse people. Oh, that black woman, that black woman, no, it can't be racist. Why is that black? Well, because this black woman don't maybe not share the same morals and values as other black people, right? As those who decided not to vote for Trump or Harris. Because there was no daylight in between the two on issues of racism, white supremacy. And that's just a fact. But again, the system uses identity to confuse us. It's okay to be black and proud. It's okay to be proud of your culture and to exhibit that. It's okay to prefer to be around people who look like you, who share those things. It's okay to do all that. But in the scheme of this institution called the U.S. government and all these different agencies practicing racism, it's incumbent upon us to see these people as a problem, as helping to perpetuate that system. Not that I'm a new age hip hop guy, meaning modern hip hop guy, but I think it was this popular song talking about they not like us. Even though it was targeting another non-white person who was perhaps a proxy as well. But yeah. So now she gets asked a question by one of the reporters, and now she can't just read from the script, so she has to come off the top of her head, right? And she got ready, as a non-white black female, has ready-made answers or ready-made lies for these questions being asked by this other woman. So let's pull that up.
On the statement.
Let me get this out the way.
On the statement you just mentioned about the ICC issuing an arrest warrant against Mr. Netanyahu and the defense minister, you said that you found the process has troubling errors. What errors do you think it has? And second, you talked about the partners. You want to discuss with partners the next step on the ICC decision. Few of your closest allies, France, Italy, Netherlands, and Canada so far, said they are abiding by the court decision and they're going to arrest Netanyahu if he steps on their soil. So did they have a different interpretation of international law than you?
So a couple of things. You asked me a couple of things. So the first thing that I will say is that obviously we reject, and we certainly have different opinions on that, and we're going to let other countries speak for themselves. We're speaking for ourselves, and so we're not going to be executing any arrest warrants. That is not something that we're going to do from here. And I do have some examples on when you asked me about the process and why we think it's essentially a flawed process. And so, in contrast to how he has treated, this is the prosecutor, how he has treated others, including Nicolas Maduro and his associates, the prosecutor failed to provide Israel with a meaningful opportunity to engage constructively and to properly consider its domestic processes. This calls into question the credibility of the prosecutor's investigation and the decision today. But we've been very clear, not just today, that we do not believe that the ICC has a jurisdiction here, and so over this matter. And so we've been very clear about that, and that stance has not changed. But I just laid out an example of why we think what process the ICC did not follow.
So what do we have right there? And she kept saying, we. So that means you're including yourself in this system of white supremacy, this particular administration, this white supremacist administration. You are including yourself in it. You could have used they, but because you want to show you a team player, you say, you use the pronouns we, just a little observation there. Just disgusted. So what did they bring up? And those were lies. Make no mistake, those were lies. Israel did file through the ICC, the International Criminal Court. They were given an opportunity to face their accuser. At one time, Netanyahu and them saying, well, we're not going to participate or what have you. But they did file a complaint and what have you. And another part of the court investigated their complaint and found it to have no merit. So they were given due process. She's lying. They are lying about the process, but they want to focus on Maduro. When has Maduro, what country has Maduro, or what people has Maduro, Nicolas Maduro of Venezuela, a country that they long had, which is an oil-rich country, they've long had designs of putting their proxy puppets in place, right? The last time they tried it was the Trump administration. Then they had elections, globally observed elections, and Nicolas Maduro won the election by independent people from outside the country. Even Jimmy Carter has long, when he was able, but his foundation, he was an election watcher. And he said they had the most secure elections in the world. But now, under the Biden administration, they won't even recognize Maduro, and again, using sanctions to practice economic white supremacy because they want the oil resources and other resources inside of Venezuela. So she's like, oh, they ain't indicted Venezuela, but wait a minute, I bet we can rewind and go back to when the ICC, which I ain't agree with it, based on the evidence, indicted Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, for war crimes. What was his crime? Removing ethnic Russian-speaking Ukrainian children. Ukrainian was their nationality. Russian is their ethnicity. Okay? And culture. And removing them from the war zone. So they, the Western nations and Zelensky and the Biden administration and the whole propaganda machine, oh, he kidnapped them children and put pressure on the ICC, the United States, the primary entity putting that pressure on, got them to indict Putin on some BS. Okay, and probably tried to do the same thing with Maduro, but what they could point to, I don't know. And they didn't do it. But the U.S. government, they were all down with the ICC and love their processes and what have you when they were indicting their declared enemies, right? But in a situation where the whole world, especially the whole non-white world, are seeing this genocide streamed, 70% are women and children. We know the casualties got to be in the hundreds of thousands. Nobody sifted through the rubble. Israelis have been caught with mass graves. Same thing I saw in Libya when the proxies of the Obama administration, the racist white supremacist government, executive branch of it, overthrew Libya and let their Arab proxies murder all of those African people who were there for jobs and work. Right? So, yeah. They just be, and I am so happy that mainstream media, the cable news networks, the MSNBCs, the CNNs have lost their audience. They're shedding viewers by the millions. You know who's gaining? Independent media producers like myself and others. I think Joe Rogan has the largest subscriber-based podcast in the world right now. Okay? You know why that is? That's because although a lot of us aren't, let me say, a lot of us aren't taught how to critically think, but you do pay attention sometimes and you remember, well, that's not what you said the last time, and now you're saying something different and you're lying. And they just don't have any faith in journalism. Credibility is everything. And people, a lot of people, millions, are seeing that they are not credible. They're just an arm of the system. And the system is controlled by billionaires, mainly white people. Okay? And they own these corporations that these networks then rely on for ad dollars. That's why Black Talk Radio Network was founded under a nonprofit and I don't run those ads. You might hear that on Time for Awakening. That's his digital radio stream. He has his own network that he manages that I help build for him, but we still partners, collaborates, sister networks. But you'll hear some advertisements on his program. I don't know about the other podcasts, but that's why you don't hear them on this one. And you don't see them on blacktalkradionetwork.com. We are entirely funded by the people, working class people. All right. So what I want to get into next is another example of proxy racism in media. Now, Malcolm X, one of the reasons I established the Black Talk Media Project was Malcolm X said that media is the most powerful entity on the planet. It can make wait a minute, let me back up. Media is the most powerful entity on the face of the planet. It can make the innocent look guilty and the guilty look innocent. It controls the minds of the masses, and that's power. He talked about in another interview with someone, with a network guy, how media can be used he didn't use the term manipulate, he used the term educate. To educate Black people how to do things for themselves, like we're trying to deconstruct white supremacy by deconstructing our role in sustaining that system in something, an area I call proxy racism. And then he talks about how it can educate white people not to be racist. And he used the example of World War II. And during the war, the Germans and Japanese were demonized in the media. They were our enemies. And the Russians and the Chinese were our allies and our friends. And that was promoted in the media. But then after the war, they changed it. They flipped the script. Like the script those two press secretaries were reading. They flipped the script. Then all the news propaganda and other forms of propaganda, movies included, Hollywood plays its role in hating the Russians and hating the Chinese and loving the Japanese, because we had done colonized them. So now we got to love them and promote goodwill towards them and goodwill towards the Germans, right? So, media. Roland Martin, Unfiltered. He was on cable news. He was on News One, which I believe TV One or TV News One, which was on the BET network, Black Entertainment Television. And he was also a CNN contributor when in 2016, he got caught helping Hillary Clinton, the white supremacist, cheat against Bernie Sanders in a CNN/TV One news debate. Him and Donna Brazile, who is also a big wig or proxy in the Democratic National Committee. Again, their role is to give the illusion that the Democrats don't practice racism, because they can't practice racism if they got Black faces in high spaces, right? So, but anyway, he got fired from that. Al Sharpton in the Black community has long been known as a charlatan. You know how he got his show on MSNBC in that shitty slot in the morning? I think it come on Saturday mornings. I don't even watch it, but he was on radio first. You know how he got on MSNBC? He filed a lawsuit against Comcast for discriminating against Black content producers, and shutting them out. And I don't know what happened with that. I know it didn't go to court, but they settled it out of court. And I think some money went to some nonprofit that was set up by, I think it was, what's the Black guy, Byron Allen, right? Who bought up the Weather Network. I think he was behind that pseudo nonprofit. But Al Sharpton got his MSNBC show as part of that settlement. Now, did that repair the other people? I don't think so. So we know for a long time, some of us have long known how Al Sharpton moves. Yeah, he'll say this is racist, that's racist, and those things can be racist, and oftentimes are racist. But he's not there, but he only really takes up those causes if he's been paid behind the scenes. That's how it used to work. I know one of his acolytes who live in my area, they charge people to take up their case and what have you. And they sell it on getting you media coverage, leveraging their media associates, the connections they done made in the mainstream. That's what you're paying for, right? And if you ain't got no money, then hell, you ain't getting no attention from Al. And then other times he'll be used to chastise black people, you know, and be the respectable black person and talk down on, you know, the field Negroes out there revolting in the streets. Then you got Oprah Winfrey. White people made Oprah Winfrey, but a lot of black women identify with her as a sign of success. You know, a lot of people who suffer from low self-esteem, they need representations of themselves to help them combat these feelings of inadequacy that they have to be taken to heart from white people. If it's not true, then I don't need no examples of this black person or that black person to prove that I'm just as smart as you or talented as you or knowledgeable as you. No, I don't need those examples. Maybe at a point in history in the United States that was important, but I don't think it's important now. But I said that to say this. Now, I haven't published this article because I am a writer as well. I haven't published this article. Let me give you the title of this article. The ethics and legality of journalists and media companies accepting campaign payments for friendly coverage. I'm talking about the Harris campaign paying millions of dollars to these three individuals, as well as alleged to some other individuals. I just don't have enough sources to put it out as a fact. But this information comes from FEC, Federal Election Committee filings by the Harris campaign that shows donations to Al Sharpton's nonprofit National Action Network, okay? A payment of $350,000 to Roland Martin's media company classified as advertisement, but really I didn't see any ads. What I saw was sit-down interviews, and then you just basically be a simp for 24/7. Which you are a simp for he's a simp for the Democrats 24/7 any damn way. He is trying to get back into one of them White House press secretary jobs and stuff like that. But he lost his place on the ladder when he got caught cheating. And it's not that he cheated. And Hillary Clinton's campaign did accept those donations. But Roland was the only one who lost his job, him and Donna Brazile, the white people. Hillary Clinton did not suffer any repercussions for it being discovered that she was cheating against Bernie Sanders. Okay? And yeah, this is all documented. So I know he's not ethical. All right, he's not an ethical journalist, but he just basically gave her, you know, the money came and then the interviews of Harris, the softball interviews, not bringing up none of her past issues and policy positions or current ones as it relates to, since she leaned into a black identity on issues that impact working class black people. On the system of slavery that's affecting us all, prison slavery affecting us all, and it's legal for us all if they convict you of a crime, but we know who is targeted the most, and that's non-white people, black people, number one. Okay? Didn't ask her none of her decisions and stuff. Didn't ask her nothing that would be considered controversial. Just softball interview, same with Oprah. And why are you giving Oprah, and Oprah claims it didn't go to her production company, but she claims it went for production cost. Okay? But you're a billionaire. And here's what possibly makes it illegal. The fact that none of them disclosed those payments before or after giving this interview. It just came out because of required FEC filings. All right? So let me give y'all some of the details. The payments in question. Reverend Al Sharpton, the Harris campaign donated $250,000 in September and October to Sharpton's nonprofit organization. Actually, his total was $500,000, $500,000 in 2 separate payments. That was paid to National Action Network. Shortly after those 2 payments, Harris appeared on Sharpton's MSNBC program for a notably friendly interview where he asked her what she envisioned as her legacy 50 years from now. Let's go to Roland Martin and his company, New Vision Media. The campaign paid $350,000 to New Vision Media, run by journalist, I will put that in quotation marks, Roland Martin, on September the 9th. Martin, who has a controversial history involving leaked debate questions during the 2016 Democratic primary, conducted a 30-minute interview with Harris on his streaming platform in October. Okay? Martin defended the payment, claiming it was for advertising, and expressed frustration that more funds weren't allocated to Black-owned media. Again, those weren't campaign ads. Dude, just like Donald Trump got free coverage and gets free coverage from many of these corporate networks, especially in 2016, they would show that dude's empty podium. You've done the same for Democrats. Your coverage slants Democrats. You're solidly on a Democratic plantation. You're not an independent. You are not an unaffiliated. Your allegiance is not number one to your community. Your allegiance is to money. Your allegiance is to the system of white supremacy. That wing we call the Democratic Party, right? The next one was Oprah Winfrey and but let me say this though. I was contacted by Blacks for Trump for an interview on Black Talk Radio Network. And you could go to them and you could ask them, what did I say when I first talked to them? I do not take money for interviews. My credibility means everything to me. And I'm not going to give you any, I'm not going to forward you any questions, nor am I going to allow you to write your questions. They wanted me to interview this Black woman, this Black religious woman associated with the Black church who had wrote an article, just a surrogate for Trump, you know, especially in the Black religious community, right? And so anyway, they could tell you, I told them that, right? And they was down with it. But I decided not to do the interview. It was like a couple of weeks before Election Day because I didn't want to give the appearance that our network supported Donald Trump. I ain't need her to come on and black-explain Donald Trump's and his agenda to me, okay? And I wasn't going to waste the time, and I am not interested in getting into fiery back and forth, sometimes devolving into name calling and screaming, and no, that's not constructive. I know that's entertaining to a lot of people and that content goes viral, but I'm not interested in making viral content. I'm interested in making productive and constructive content. Others who have been following me for a number of years know that when 2020, when Michael Bloomberg, was it 2020? Yeah, it was 2020. When Michael Bloomberg was running in the Democratic primary, that his people reached out to the Black Talk Radio Network, which of course is managed by the Black Talk Media Project, and was offering payment to run ads on our networks. We do have the capability to put banner ads and stuff like that, and we had the capability to put audio ads within our digital radio streams and our podcasting feeds, but we told them no. Because I know, again, I have this rule, we do not accept money from corporations or politicians. If I'm going to bring you on, or if I'm going to, in my personal capacity, express any support for you, it's because I believe in the policies that you're promoting. Or I know you personally and I can vouch for you. What are the ethical implications of these proxies? The relationship between journalists, media companies, and political campaigns are foundational to public trust in journalism. And I'm here to tell you, you cannot trust these people. You can't trust them. They all reading from a script if they're on the cable networks. Roland Martin trying to get back in to that inner sanctum of white supremacy. You know, he's pretty good at coming up with his own scripts and mixing it up to make it seem like he's some radical black man. Oh, I'm calling Trump names, or I'm calling out these black Republicans. And dude, I know what you're doing. I know who you are, and I know what your role is. Payments from political campaigns to media figures or their organizations, especially when followed by favorable coverage, can create the perception or reality of compromised journalistic integrity. Ethical concerns include conflict of interest, erosion of public trust, and double standards in accountability. Okay. I doubt if they even invited Donald Trump on to give him equal time. You know what I'm saying? Man. But anyway, very unethical and could be illegal. And I guess I'll publish that article later. I've been on for a while. I've been going over 2 hours, and I do want to wrap this up to preserve the file size so I can upload it as a podcast. But I'll leave you with this. While the payments may raise ethical concerns, their legality hinges on how the funds were categorized and disclosed under FEC regulations. Campaign expenditures must serve a legitimate campaign purpose and be properly reported. Relevant legal questions include, were the payments disclosed accurately? Roland Martin? Were the payments excessive or improperly categorized? And was there campaign coordination with media outlets? And then it has broader implications for democracy, but I'm gonna leave it there. The last modern example of racism or proxy racism, again, I'm a Black man trying to get my community to recognize and consider how we aid the system that we complain so much about. And if we are not willing to sacrifice, whether that means not being able to get certain jobs, y'all think I can go? I use my real name. I use my real name because I just got through talking about journalistic integrity and credibility, and people using pseudonyms and fake names on the internet and calling themselves political analysts or news writers and what have you. No, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. So I use my real name. Don't you think that would prohibit me or hinder me from getting certain corporate opportunities? And I do get a lot of views on my LinkedIn profile, being my expertise in the area of communications with my military training in communications, and also my prior corporate jobs, whether they were in the technical service industry working for cell phone companies, or whether it was working in the corporate sourcing companies for textile. I had that experience. But now that I'm public, I've been doing a podcast and a broadcast since 2007 using my real name. I first started with a pseudonym, but using my real name for the last 15 years. These people can look me up. You Google my name, you're going to come up with this content first. And so that hinders me. But that's a sacrifice I make to be honest and straightforward about the system of white supremacy, what it is and how it works. And again, recognizing that we non-white people play a critical role in it being able to continue, right? So the last thing I want to get to is misinformation. We hear the Democrats talk a lot about misinformation, but Democrats engage in it too. And people of different racial classifications also engage in disinformation, intentionally or unintentionally. And so what I'm trying to figure out, let me just close something right quick, is if U.S. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett intentionally lying about white people in the United States never being oppressed. Okay? So this came up right before I was coming on air, maybe 30 minutes before I was due to come on air tonight. Again, every Saturday night, I will try to come on with a live broadcast of deconstructing proxy racism. But I was like, man, I got to include this because I've talked about before how a lot of Black women, particularly young Black women, because of the way she dressed, her modern style, if you will. And again, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with looking how you want to look and being clean and what have you. At least you wash your behind and all of that, and you groom yourself. But we know she's using a lot of product though, right? Which we in the Black community do talk about. That income or source of revenue going out of the Black community and not being recirculated. But a lot of these Black women do identify with her solely on that identity and are not so much concerned of the policies that she is signing her name onto or the organization she's taking money from. Okay? And so I feel like her statement, and this is in quotes from Phase 2 Africa, which is a page I follow on Facebook. Let me just read the excerpt. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has firmly rejected the notion that white men face oppression in the United States, dismissing the assertion as unfounded during a House hearing. So I'll possibly come up with the clip for next week's broadcast. But this part is in quotation, so this means she said that if they're operating under, journalistic rules. In quotations, there has been no oppression for the white man in this country. Now, I'm sure that went viral. A lot of black people and other non-white people, particularly women, were circulating that. It probably went viral with them. Her saying that is going viral. Oh, look at Jasmine popping her ish. Oh, she told them off. And that girl got fire. Oh, 100%. 100%. That's the truth. 100. But is it true, though? Is it true? See, I don't study just black history in America. I study it all, because all of it is American history. So that means I'm starting from the foundation of the colonies. I'm starting there. And how it started with indentured servitude and then went to chattel slavery. But during, what's the name of that first rebellion of indentured servitude? I can't remember the name. Oh man, I used to talk about it a lot. It was called, I can't think of it. But it was where white, this is before the creation of the classifications of white and black, but these were European and African indentured servants who were being mistreated, who were not being protected from, those indigenous First Nation tribes who were attacking these colonies. And so they was like, you know what? We're going to take up arms and we're going to rebel against the system, right? And then that's when they came up with the system of racism, white supremacy. It all was created to maintain a system of slavery here in the United States, right? But does that mean then that the working class, now classified as white, European, formerly indentured servants, were then treated as equal and given an equal share of the stolen resources? No. A lot of them died and couldn't survive. Whether they came from the jails of England or the prisons of England, we think about the penal colonies and what have you, which Australia was of a UK penal colony, okay? Do you think they treated them the same? No, they treated them different because they was practicing a different kind of ism that they had always been practicing. Classism came before racism. I would argue that. I haven't done deep research into it, but based off of what I do know, I would say classism existed before racism, white supremacy did, okay? So they had always been, before the Irish came over here, right? They were classified, they were being preyed upon and oppressed by who? The English, right? The Anglo-Saxons, the queens and kings of England, and what have you, right? They were being intentionally starved. Maybe that's why a lot of these Irish and those Irish peacekeepers in Lebanon being shot at and injured by these Israelis, maybe that's why they standing up for the Palestinians. Maybe that's why they trying to stop this white supremacist genocide, because that's what it is. It ain't got nothing to do with religion. It has to do with Zionism, a political movement that is based on white supremacy. White people created Zionism. White Germans created it. Wealthy ones created it, right? And so I can just look at like my own county history. Here in Gaston County, working class whites had a rebellion. They were working, I don't know what that particular mill was producing. Yeah, I think it was a cotton mill, right? They're providing the majority of the jobs here in North Carolina, in Gaston County, the textile companies. So you had all these cotton mills where the cotton mills even built housing for these poor whites that's working in the mills. The poor whites weren't owning these houses. They were renting the houses from the owners that's classism. And they were being mistreated. The safety conditions were horrible. They weren't being paid what they were worth. And guess what they did? And the police were being used to keep them in line. Whenever there was a smaller like demonstration or boycott, then they would send the police. They would send the police to bust them poor whites across the head. That happened here in Gaston County, North Carolina. It's part of a small museum exhibit that I've been to. Okay, I think it was called the Firestone Rebellion. But if you just look up working class or white working class labor, what do you think the labor movements were all about? Whether the movement was against the owners of the coal mines of West Virginia, whether they were the white laborers also working on the railroads, it don't matter. They were not being viewed as equal. And they still don't view them equal as today. And that's the trick of white supremacy, right? To get these poor, working class whites to first believe in the American dream that capitalism affords everyone the opportunity to make it. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunities, but what compromises, what moral compromises, what ethical considerations may come up? And so that would eliminate me from some of those opportunities because I don't want to invest in private prisons because I'm not a slaver. It violates my moral principles, right? But for her, that's either her being ignorant of American history and the labor movement in general, which was predominantly white. And yes, they did practice racism against black workers and kept them out. But to say, though, that these people were never oppressed, well, that's just not true, is it? There's plenty of documentation in history. Go look up the whiskey rebellion of, I can't remember the year. I think it was in Tennessee, the Tennessee Whiskey Rebellion. And they used violence to put these white people down. What about those drafted, the poor working class white people drafted to go fight in Vietnam, who weren't going to benefit from the rubber plantations that the corporations and the other resources that the wealthy white upper class was going to profit? No, you're just going to die. And we'll just call it patriotism, get you to buy into that. All of this stuff is still going on today. So either she is ignorant of American history, or guess what? It's even more sinister. She's just intentionally being provocative and controversial to generate headlines. And so then that keeps those two working class people separated and not coming together and understanding how we're all victims in this system of white supremacy, which is to ultimately uphold capitalism. And if anybody says capitalism isn't based on racism or slavery for all, go read the 13th Amendment, then you're just uneducated. You need to really spend more time online or at the library and expanding whatever your content consumption is. But with that said, I'm going to go ahead and bring it in. Didn't mean to go this long, but I was having self-inflicted issues with this broadcast, and I'll be better on the next one, I promise. But this was the first episode of Deconstructing Proxy Racism, a program meant to help non-white people see their role in upholding a system of white supremacy. Before we close out, let's give that definition one more time. And that definition is the phenomenon of non-white individuals supporting or advancing systemic white supremacy through their actions, decisions, or rhetoric, which is words, whether knowingly or inadvertently. So let's hope that we can help people become more cognizant of how it works so they can make a conscious decision to not participate. That's the only way we're going to bring this system to a close. Either I wasn't paying attention or I need to reconfigure some things, but I will check. Again, I'm trying to get used to this thing, get used to this platform. Okay, oh yeah, so no guest requests. I didn't see any. So that's cool too. Maybe people just sitting back and listening. Maybe I explained it well enough that you didn't have any questions. But with that said, until next week, Saturday night, 9:00 p.m. Eastern time, we hope that you will join us for the live broadcast. And again, help share the broadcast. Go to blacktalkradionetwork.com and you'll find it there. Although I do got to create the podcast feed. I'll work on that tonight and tomorrow. All right, with that said, peace and blessings to all. Y'all be safe out there.